Hello everyone, this is Dr. Stevens with a lecture on metaphor and symbol. In this lecture I want to talk about how to identify and describe a metaphor, and then also how to identify a symbol. So let's get started. In general, there are two parts to a metaphor, and remember that we're talking about metaphor in poetry in particular. There's metaphor all over the place, and language, by the way, is highly metaphorical. You are using metaphor on a regular basis throughout the day when you speak, whether you know it or not. But we are focusing on the use of metaphor in poetry. And we say that there are two parts to a metaphor. There is the metaphor itself. Okay, let's call this the metaphor proper. And then there is the thing that the metaphor represents. Now, there is a handy little concept here that helps us to see the two parts of a metaphor. And it's called tenor, that's part one, and vehicle. All right, so the tenor is the thing that the metaphor represents, while the vehicle is the metaphor itself. Let's look at an example. This example is from Mary Oliver's Mockingbirds, poem by Mary Oliver, contemporary American poet. The poem Mockingbirds. And by the way, if your Tegrity player is showing you a picture, or you may be playing this back in YouTube, you might not see a picture, but if you do see a picture along with this recording, the bird in the picture is a mockingbird, and I chose that picture because those little musical notes that have been inserted into the photograph are reminiscent of mockingbird song. And Oliver's poem begins. It's a long poem. This is just from the poem. It's not the entire poem. But the poem begins with a metaphor about mockingbird song. So let's look at it. This morning, two mockingbirds in the green field were spinning and tossing the white ribbons of their songs into the air. I had nothing better to do than listen. I mean this seriously. All right? This morning, two mockingbirds in the green field were spinning and tossing the white ribbons of their songs into the air. I had nothing better to do than listen. I mean this seriously. And those three little stanzas, quatrains, right? 4-line stanza. Those 3 4-line stanzas then introduce a much longer poem. And I encourage you to read the whole poem. I'm not including it in this lecture, but you can find the poems in this lecture. There are several. You can find them by going to a site such as Poetry Foundation. poetryfoundation.org, a very, very good site for your study of poetry, because you can find not only individual poems such as this one, but you can find information about poetry, a glossary of terms related to poetry and literature, and so on. Let's get back to our metaphor. All right? The metaphor itself, the green highlight then, is the metaphor, the vehicle, we say. All right? And then the yellow highlight is the tenor, the thing that the metaphor represents. So we say that spinning and tossing the white ribbons is a metaphor for songs. All right? The song of the mockingbirds, That's a literal thing. Mockingbirds literally sing songs. They make bird song, right? Okay, but spinning and tossing white ribbons is a metaphor for their singing. All right, so here we go. In describing a metaphor, use this formula. Blank, all right? Blank is a metaphor for blank, all right? Where the first blank then would be your vehicle, okay? It would name the metaphor, and then the second blank would be the tenor. So, if I'm describing this metaphor in Mary Oliver's poem, I'm saying that white ribbons being spun and tossed, all right, is a metaphor for mockingbird song, all right? So, let's look at this issue a little more closely. Why am I bringing this up? Why am I telling you? Some of you might be saying, well, Dr. Stevens, I know this, okay? Let's get on with the serious stuff. Let's start interpreting these metaphors. I'm bringing it up because there is a problem that I have found in my teaching of poetry, and the problem is that students will often say things like such and such is a metaphor without saying what the metaphor is. So I can't tell. I can't tell what the student is referring to, or whoever is talking about the metaphor, right? We don't understand what they are referring to unless they give us an example, or unless they specify what the metaphor itself is. So, for example, someone might be talking about the Mary Oliver poem, and they might say something such as, two mockingbirds spinning and tossing the white ribbons of their songs is a metaphor. No, it is not a metaphor. The statement, that whole statement by itself, does quote a line from the poem in which there is a metaphor. But that statement by itself does not identify the metaphor, okay? Right? It does not identify the metaphor for the simple reason that it includes both the metaphor and the thing that the metaphor represents. Okay? So we wonder, okay, what well, so-and-so is saying this is metaphorical, but what's the metaphor? Okay? We are not being told. So, to identify a metaphor, we need to say what the metaphor is, okay? In order to do that, we must distinguish. We must distinguish. Let's bold that. Okay? We must separate the words that constitute the metaphor, all right? And the words that name the object. That is the thing that the metaphor represents. All right. So, that's what this is really getting at. How can we clearly specify what is the metaphor and what the metaphor is referring to, the object of the metaphor? Okay? Now, how do we know there's a metaphor to begin with, right? If you're reading a poem, how do you know that something is a metaphor? Please do not assume that all the words in a poem are metaphorical. They certainly are not. They are not necessarily. There are many poems that are literal, straight through. We'll look at one of those, a short example anyway, toward the end of this lecture. So please do not just go around saying, oh, there's a metaphor here, there's a metaphor there. No, 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 no. Okay, the language of poetry is very often highly metaphorical, but it is not necessarily. We know there is a metaphor present when something literal in the poem, all right, becomes literally impossible in the way that thing, the literal thing, is being referred to. So, in Mary Oliver's poem, we have birdsong. The reference to the song of the mockingbirds is literal. Okay? The poet literally means that she, the speaker in this case, all right, the speaker is literally standing by a green field or in a green field and listening to actual physical material bird song. The bird song itself is not a metaphor. Okay? But then she goes on to refer to white ribbons being spun and tossed. Mockingbirds do not spin or toss white ribbons. Okay, we know this is not literally possible, right? So we say, oh, okay, well, that business about tossing and spinning white ribbons must be meant metaphorically. Let's look at some other examples of metaphor. This is from Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. All right, again, it's from the poem. It's not the entire poem, just the first two stanzas. Again, 4-line stanzas, quatrains, right? Quatrain is a 4-line stanza. And so she writes, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. Oh my goodness, what is going on here? How would we describe this? All right, let's go back to our formula, right, for describing a poem. Let's see, where was that? Okay. All right, we use a poem. We use a formula, I'm sorry. Okay, we use a formula, blank, right? Okay, this is the way you say it. Okay, if you want to tell me there's a metaphor in a poem, then use this formula. Blank, Dr. Stevens, you say, is a metaphor for blank. And so, white ribbons being tossed is a metaphor for Mockingbird's song. And in Emily Dickinson's poem, then, the coachman, okay, the coachman, that is somebody who drives a horse-drawn carriage, is a metaphor for what? Is a metaphor for death. How do you know this? Okay, all right. You know this because she starts out by referring to death. She refers to death, okay? But then she's saying death stopped for me. You know, death is simply the state of no longer being alive, okay? Death does not walk around, okay, starting and stopping, and death certainly does not drive a carriage, okay? So death is not a carriage, right, or be a carriage being driven, okay? And we've got drive here, drove, okay? So this carriage is being driven. These things aren't literally possible, okay? When you go to the hospital because someone in your family is dying, or a friend, a loved one is dying, and so on, okay, you don't say, oh, we got this carriage here, and we've got this coachman driving this carriage, and so on and so forth. No, you don't. Not literally. It's not possible. All right? But we can talk about death metaphorically. And folks, we, in our ordinary language, we talk about death metaphorically all the time, right? We say things like, oh my goodness, my uncle is at death's door. All right? Well, death doesn't have a door. Okay? A door is something that you have in a building, in a house, that you walk through, right? But we mean it metaphorically. And in this particular case, obviously, Dickinson means the carriage and the coachman driving the carriage and so on, metaphorically, as a metaphor for death. Let's go on then and look at This sonnet by Shakespeare, Sonnet 116. All right, fairly well known sonnet. There are over 150 Shakespearean sonnets, some of them more familiar than others. This one is a fairly familiar sonnet, so let's look at it. Okay, I'm going to read through, and there are several metaphors in this sonnet, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but again, as with the Oliver poem, the yellow identifies the tenor and the green identifies the metaphor itself. But the poem deserves to be read in its entirety, so let's do that. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Let's look then at the metaphor, or actually two metaphors I'm looking at here, okay? It, the ever-fixed mark, and it, the star to every wandering bark. Okay? So, using our formula, okay? Something, right? Something is the tenor. We're using a different formula here, folks. Tenor and vehicle, so we say something is the tenor and something is the vehicle. All right, so in the first of our metaphors, it is the tenor. Now, let's be clear about this. Readers sometimes get a little confused or simply forget pronouns and the pronoun reference. Okay, it refers to love. So let's stick love in there. Let's not be confused about what that pronoun it refers to. It refers to one thing and one thing only. It refers to love. So love then is the tenor, meaning it's the thing that the metaphor refers to, and the ever-fixed mark is the vehicle, meaning it is the metaphor itself. So we say then that the ever-fixed mark, using our other formula, the ever-fixed mark is a metaphor for love. And so let's go back to our second one, okay? It is the star to every wandering bark, and bark, by the way, is a kind of ship. So these are nautical or maritime metaphors here, all right? The mark would be like the navigational marks that seamen use, that mariners use to find their way. Could be something like a buoy, could be something like a lighthouse, that sort of thing, all right? And then the wandering bark would be a kind of sailing ship. And then the star, okay, would be, again, like the ever-fixed mark, the star would be something that would be used by the sailors to navigate. Okay, Shakespeare's writing at a time before satellites and GPS, and so the stars were used for navigation. So we say then for our second metaphor that the star to every wandering bark is a metaphor for love. So far, so good? So then, why this fuss over distinguishing between the metaphor and the thing it represents? We need to do so for the purposes of interpretation. Okay? So interpretation requires that we be clear about what the metaphor says about its object. And you can't talk about what the metaphor is saying about the object of the metaphor or the tenor unless you have a clear identification of what the metaphor is. So in the Shakespearean metaphor, for example, the first one there, the ever-fixed mark, we have to say what an ever-fixed mark is by itself, okay? What is an ever-fixed mark? Let's just focus on that. Leave the it, leave love aside for the time being, and let's just focus on that ever-fixed mark, because in order to understand what Shakespeare is saying about love, we need to understand the metaphor itself. In order to understand the metaphor itself, we need to know what the metaphor is. We need to know what it is independently of love, which is the thing it refers to, right? So, let me say briefly, this is not a lecture in interpretation, but if we look at an ever-fixed mark, if we look at that, the ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken, and we think about lighthouses, for example, okay? We think about that lighthouse standing firmly, say, on the rocks on the shore, okay? And it doesn't matter how bad a storm there is, right? That lighthouse is going to be shining. It's going to be something that the sailors can see in order to navigate, in order to avoid hitting the rocks, right? We say, oh yeah, that's what an ever-fixed mark is, okay? We're not going to jump to conclusions about what Shakespeare is saying about it, that is about love. We're going to look carefully at the metaphor itself, and then we're going to say, oh yeah, okay, love, right, love is steadfast. Love is always there. The light of love, like the light in the lighthouse, does not go out. And furthermore, we say, oh yeah, right, like that ever-fixed mark, love can guide us. Love can guide our lives. Love can guide us in the right way, and so on. You see, now what I'm doing is I'm interpreting, aren't I? I'm taking that metaphor and I'm saying, okay, this is what I think the metaphor is telling us about love. Now I'm in interpretation. But I cannot do that unless I am clear about what the metaphor itself is. Okay, enough. Let's go on to symbol. First of all, a symbol is not to be confused with metaphor. Okay? So let's go through these bullets here. Bullet number 1, a metaphor is a figure of speech, meaning that it is a turning of words so that they no longer are meant literally, okay, to apply to something they are not. Remember, we talked about metaphor takes, we know there's a metaphor if we take something literal and then we say something about that literal thing that is literally impossible, okay? But figuratively is, metaphorically is possible, okay? But with a metaphor, we always know that the use of those words as a metaphor is obvious. We know that that ever-fixed mark is meant by Shakespeare to refer to love. It is an ever-fixed mark. There's no confusion there, right? Song is the white ribbons being turned and spun and tossed and so on, right? Death is the driver of that carriage, that horse-drawn vehicle and so on, right? We know that, okay, because that is specified by the language itself. But a symbol is not a figure of speech. Symbol, when we say something is a symbol for something else, we are interpreting something literal, okay? You'll see what I mean as we go along here. So there are conventional symbols, okay? And a conventional symbol, we use them all the time, all right? That stoplight, or, right? When that stoplight turns red, that is a symbol for the command stop, right? Okay. Or, you know, if we're in a battle, we don't do this anymore, right? But in the old days, we say a white flag that is waved in a battle means I surrender. These are conventional symbols. Poetry does not use conventional symbols, at least not in the conventional sense. In poetry, symbols are different because they have a wide range of possible meanings, and they are open to and depend upon interpretation. Okay? Finally, and this is the important thing, a symbol in a poem not being figurative is usually the interpretation of something literal in the poem. Okay? We do not treat, going back to the Mary Oliver poem, the spinning and tossing of white ribbons as if it were literal. We know that no, she does not mean that literally. Okay? But let's look at some examples of symbols, and then we'll get back to this idea of the literal. This is one of the most widely used, most familiar symbols, and that is the rose. And what does it symbolize? It can symbolize a lot of things. It very often symbolizes love. It very often symbolizes beauty because roses are beautiful. But roses, and I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, have experienced this, roses also wither. Okay, all flowers do, but we're talking about roses here. Roses wither and they get kind of ugly, right? Meaning they get sick and they die. So roses can also be used to symbolize mortality or even death. So what it means then, what that rose means in a particular poem depends on the context that the poem creates. All right, let's look at this little poem by Sarah Cleghorn. And this, by the way, is the complete poem. Just one quatrain. No roses in this one. We're looking at something different. I would just brought up the rose as an example of a very familiar object, literal object, a flower that is used symbolically. But this poem reads, "The golf links lies so near the mill that almost every day the laboring children can look out and see the men at play." No metaphors here, folks. Sarah Cleghorn is imagining, she might actually herself have seen this scene, but her speaker, that is the person who is in this poem saying these words, is referring to an actual golf course, is referring to an actual mill, that is a factory, all right, is referring to literal laboring children. Laboring children are not a metaphor for anything. The golf links are not a metaphor for anything. And there really are men playing golf. All right, the men at play, literal men actually playing golf, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. Okay, but, okay, everything in the poem then, I say, is meant literally, and everything in the poem can be interpreted symbolically. How? Okay? How interpret? Use the context. All right? Use the context. We have children. We have child labor. Right? Let's put that in here. Okay, we have child labor. We have golf links and we have factories. Okay? So we have what? We have the leisure activities, okay, of the what we call leisured class. Oops, leisured class, right? And we have this contrasted with working class in the factories, right? And so we have men at play, okay? And the men at play then are people of leisure. E-I-S-U-R-E. Okay, they have time and money on their hands. We've established the context in which we have child labor. Fortunately, we no longer have child labor, children working in factories, but the context is clearly established here. We have children who work, and they work hard, they work long days. We say, yeah, we know all about that, right? Because we know about the use of child labor. And then we've got these rich guys who have enough money to pay the country club fees and enough time to go out and play golf. And we say, okay, in this context then, okay, I can say golf links symbolize say golf links and the mill, the factories, or the men at play versus the children working. I can say these things symbolize the division of the classes in society between, I'm going to say, between the haves and the have-nots, right? Okay, or I can even go a little farther and say, I can say these things symbolize the oppression of by the wealthy of the working class. Okay? Now, what am I doing when I do that? I'm still interpreting, aren't I? That's an interpretation. Somebody else might come along and say something different about what these things mean. Okay? And why can they do that? They're not being tied the way a metaphor is to any specific meaning. Metaphor is tied to a specific meaning. It's tied to a specific object, right? A symbol is not. All right? A symbol is open to interpretation. So remember, when you've got a symbol, you've got something that is meant literally, as opposed to a metaphor in which something has to be meant figuratively because whatever it refers to can't possibly be doing that, right? Okay? And everything in a poem then that is literal can be interpreted symbolically. Well, that's it, folks. Okay, remember that to interpret a symbol, you need to clearly identify the context. In order to understand a metaphor, you need to make that clear distinction between the metaphor and the thing it represents. Thanks for listening. I'll see you online.